Hello, and welcome to Faculty Friday. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Delighted to welcome you to our first Faculty Friday of the year, a conversation with Assistant Professor Debak about nuclear crises and proliferation. Not that long ago, we were hardly talking about nuclear. It certainly was a big deal in my youth, but for a long time, there were other topics that sort of took priority. We certainly focused on war on terror and anti-terrorism efforts, et cetera, but not anymore. Between the controversies over the Iran deal, Vladimir Putin's none too subtle threats in the context of the Ukraine invasion, China's rapid buildup of its nuclear arsenal, and of course, Oppenheimer, nuclear weapons, nuclear conflict, nuclear proliferation are really back on the table. And really no one better to discuss that with than Debak, my colleague here at the Korbel School, where he teaches courses on international security and does research on nuclear issues, in particular around how states build their nuclear forces. And very interestingly, we'll get into this, the ways in which the efforts to contain proliferation have in some ways accelerated innovation and delivery systems, which may be destabilizing in of itself. He is, for his stage of career, remarkably prominent and well-supported. He's been generously supported by the MacArthur Foundation, the Wilson Center, the Judith Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies, Cornell University's Graduate School, Cornell Institute for European Studies, and the Chateaubriand Fellowship. So lots of people out there paying attention to his work. He has a PhD from Cornell University and master's degrees in politics and international relations from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. And he formerly held positions actually at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies and the Center for Dialogue and Reconciliation in New Delhi, where among other things, his work involved extensive Track 2 dialogues between India and Pakistan. We may get to that as well. But welcome to Faculty Friday.
Thank you very much, Fritz. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, well, I look forward to our conversation, albeit on a kind of a serious topic, to be sure. So let's start with Oppenheimer. There's this famous quote from Hindu scripture. Now I've become death, the destroyer of worlds, that famously associated with Oppenheimer as he grappled with the magnitude of what it was he helped to create. And so I just thought we should start, with sort of a basic question, which is, what is so different about nuclear weapons? Why do we need to think about them differently if we do?
Thanks for the question, Fritz. Let me start with a little bit of Oppenheimer trivia, which is that, that quote, now I'm become death destroyer of worlds. A lot of people actually attribute it to him having said that right after the Trinity test on July 16th, 1945. But that's not the case. Oh. He apparently said it much later at a dinner conversation with his brother and a few friends. And the first time you actually see him talk about it is actually on PBS as late as the early 1960s. I think maybe it was 65 or something of that sort. So part of it is apocryphal. Part of it is this larger myth-making of Oppenheimer, this person thinking about nuclear weapons, death and Shiva and the Bhagavad Gita and all of that. But to answer your question more directly, I think nuclear weapons are different because of just the sheer amount of destruction that it can cause. And when I say sheer amount of destruction, it's not just the point in time when the nuclear weapon is used, but the generations of harm that it can cause after. So if you look at Japan today, or one of the issues that isn't talked about a whole lot is nuclear testing. Right, so places where nuclear weapons have in fact been used in the form of tests, not as an act of war, you still have people affected by radiation, by a lot of those what people are called downwinders of New Mexico, for example, or people directly from in the South Pacific, the Marshall Islands. So there's an intergenerational aspect to the use of nuclear weapons, which is extremely scary. And the second thing is, there are international physicians who have come out with multiple reports on, how even a limited nuclear war with just tactical nuclear weapons, so low-yield nuclear weapons, might actually spark off 2 billion deaths in the form of a nuclear famine because of the global climate crisis that, well, already exists, but there would be a new one, and that would be a nuclear famine, which would lead to global temperatures dropping nearly 2%, nearly by 2 Celsius, not 2%, but all of those things come together, make nuclear weapons put them in a special place, something that your average conventional weapons do not necessarily do.
Yeah. Well, now that we've got everyone sufficiently frightened and attentive, because it has been fascinating, because I grew up, in sort of the wake of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we spent a lot of time sort of thinking, and then it sort of receded. I think we've not been as attentive probably to the magnitude of this in the past. So let's turn to some of the immediate risks that these weapons might be used in, and start with Ukraine. Putin made clear that, reminding the world that they're a nuclear power, and not too subtly sort of suggested that was an option. And there's been a lot of conversation about the possibility of use. Now, here we're talking, you mentioned the word tactical in passing, and may be useful to define that, but we're talking about, I think, battlefield tactical weapons as opposed to strategic. Maybe that's a useful distinction. But let me just ask you, the fundamental question on people's minds is, how great is the risk that the conflict in Ukraine could escalate into the use of nuclear weapons?
So let me first just make the difference between strategic nuclear weapons and tactical nuclear weapons. So strategic nuclear weapons tend to be weapons that are long range, big yields. So they're meant to destroy cities. In the nuclear parlance, we say they're used for counter value strikes, which means that they're used for strikes on civilians. They're used on cities, maybe New York, maybe Washington, D.C., something like that. And some of the weapons, for example, the US right now has a B-83 bomb, which is about 1.2 megatons, which means that it's basically about 80 times stronger than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. So these, as you can tell, are huge, like very big effect sort of weapons. Now, tactical nuclear weapons are a little different. They're shorter range. They're also called non-strategic nuclear weapons, which is to distinguish it from strategic use, which means that it's not meant to be used on civilians. It's meant to be used on small battlefield military units or something of that sort. But the funny thing is, even though we say tactical nuclear weapon, short range, low yield, will not have a lot of radiation effect, a lot of tactical nuclear weapons today have a yield that's higher than that of Hiroshima. Yeah. So there is a debate on whether tactical use of nuclear weapons is actually tactical. You might say you're using a tactical nuclear weapon in South Asia, for example, against a particular military unit, but then population densities are so high. Would it actually be just tactical and against a military unit, or would civilians also suffer? So those are questions to think about. But in terms of the question on Ukraine, look, we're all really worried, right? The chances of the use of nuclear weapons is higher than we would like it to be. The threats by Putin have made that clear. The deployment of nuclear weapons in Belarus have obviously upped the ante a fair bit. But what's interesting is, and what gives me a little bit of calm when I'm looking at the issue is, despite the severe military losses that the Russians have taken, and they've taken a lot of losses, certainly way more than the Ukrainians, they've still not turned to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And so there's some hope to be taken there, but that doesn't mean that we should be complacent. I think the nuclear risk in Ukraine right now, a greater risk than the use of a direct tactical nuclear weapon, is the potential that you might actually see an attack on a nuclear power plant. The conversation that's been happening around Zaporizhia, for example. And just 2 days ago, in fact, Putin put out a statement saying that the Ukrainian drones had attacked a Rosatom-operated nuclear power plant, a Russian nuclear power plant. And that was apparently done with the help of the United Kingdom. Now, this might entirely be misinformation. We're not sure. But is it going to be some sort of excuse to sort of pretend that an attack on Zaporizhia is a retaliation? We don't know, but that's something that's foremost on our minds when we're thinking of nuclear risks, at least.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about the kind of military logic of use in the risks there. I was fascinated. You write about in some of your writings about the ways in which international public opinion might act to actually be a constraint on the use. That is to say that the diplomatic fallout, the reaction of the world to such use would be so severe that would give someone pause. So the two questions here really, how does that work? Like why would Putin be constrained by what India thinks about his use, and then how does, in your own mind, how does that diminish the threat that he would actually use these weapons in Ukraine?
So I think it's two-part question. So let me get to it. So first of all, does international public opinion matter during nuclear crises? Right? I think yes. The reason that it matters is that states care about their reputation. They want to be seen as a good actor in the international sphere. Now, that doesn't mean that states are doing this out of just some sort of normative sense of we want to be seen as good. There are also very tangible benefits to being seen as a good actor. Scientific cooperation, trade, commerce being very important, and military help, of course, is another one. Now, if you're a superpower, you might say, well, superpowers might not need those sorts of help. But even during the Cuban Missile Crisis, you saw the US and the Soviet Union try to appeal to what they called the court of the international audience, the world of public opinion. And so that mattered even during those crises and subsequent crises that we've seen, the Kargil War being an example, where states have tried to be seen as not the aggressor. How might this play out in Ukraine? I think that one important aspect of the Ukraine war and the way that it's been playing out in the diplomatic world is that there are a number of global South countries that have not been in favor of the Western sanctions. They have not necessarily been on board with the US and its allies when it comes to voting in the UN. And a large part of that is that Russia seems to have been able to keep up their reputation with these states. They are conducting trade. Countries like India have expanded their trade on oil exponentially. But what's interesting is every time Russia has made a threat about nuclear weapons or the potential use of nuclear weapons, you've seen a lot of squeamishness from these countries. India has put out multiple statements saying nuclear threats are not acceptable. In the middle of about a year ago, actually now, when the Russians were talking about the potential use of a dirty bomb, the Indian defense minister came out and said, we don't think the Ukrainians have used a dirty bomb or are close to doing that. We do not support the use of nuclear weapons. And in fact, there are recent reports that say that Xi Jinping himself has personally told Putin that the use of nuclear weapons will not be tolerated. So there is a broad audience that right now has not been alienated by Russia that might actually be alienated if nuclear weapons are used. And especially countries in the global South that are happily doing trade with the Russians right now and are not voting against Russia. All those countries, Latin America, there's a nuclear weapons free zone. There's a rich tradition of nuclear disarmament and anti-nuclear thought. Africa, nuclear weapons free zone. And when I say Africa, I mean most of the countries in Africa, and all the countries in Africa right now actually are part of this free zone. So there is a broader consensus there that nuclear weapons use is not acceptable. So this might be hopeful, but we are hoping that that might be some sort of check in terms of international public opinion on Putin and the use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, and I think that's a very helpful perspective. It's often heard in the public discourse, and it is, as you say, a little bit more hopeful picture. Let me turn you to a different part of the world that you know a lot about. another kind of flashpoint for potential use or place where there's been conflict. Of course, for years, the India-Pakistan dynamic in play, both countries now nuclear powers. But you write about the really interesting dynamic now among India, Pakistan, and China, and in some sense, the United States is in the background, I suppose. As I understand it, as China is sort of ramping up its nuclear weapons in a sense to compete with or to compare with the U.S., that sort of has a knock-on effect of India feeling that it has to modernize, maybe expand, I don't know. And then that in turn destabilizes the somewhat delicate situation with India and Pakistan. So did I get that right? What are the dynamics at work here? And to what extent do to what extent does this constitute a significant risk of some kind of nuclear conflict?
So I think we're less worried about nuclear conflict in the sense that there'll be nuclear weapons being used right away. I think there's an escalation ladder there. And what we're worried about is that at the lower levels of the escalation ladder, there's an arms race, right? And the heart of the matter really goes back to the fact that India and China have about 3,500 kilometers of disputed border, which is called the line of actual control. So where the two militaries meet, it's not actually an international border. So what we're seeing in the last few years, and this has been going on before as well, but right now it's more concentrated, they're coming fast, which is that China comes into parts of Indian territory, sets up camp, and then India is trying to push these Chinese soldiers out. There was a very big incident in 2020 in the Galwan Valley in the Himalayas near Ladakh. And, soldiers fought each other. These are two armies of two nuclear nations who were fighting each other, not with guns, but with sticks, stones, and bamboo poles with nails on them. It's rather gruesome stuff. So that one might say, well, that's a low level of escalation, but what from there to a nuclear level, maybe not. That might not be something that happens. Cooler heads would presumably prevail. But what these altercations have done is that they've made India think long and hard and very seriously about what kind of weapons capacity do they have to be able to tackle Chinese aggression and deter a larger land grab by China. And to that effect, it started and it's created this integrated rocket force in order to be able to use conventional ballistic missiles against China in specific theaters, especially areas which land is disputed. Now, the concern that some folks have, myself included, with that is that thus far India's ballistic missiles have all been for nuclear use. Now, there's a separate strategic forces command which is going to control these missiles. But if you take the same missile, say an Agni-P, and you put it in your strategic nuclear force with a nuclear warhead, and then you put a conventional warhead on it and keep it in your conventional force, if I'm China or if I'm Pakistan and I'm seeing this missile come at me, I have less than 5 minutes to figure out whether this is nuclear armed or not and how I'm going to respond to it. That increases the risk of escalation. And so that's something that we're definitely worried about. In terms of, so then you see India responding to China. Now, China has an overwhelming asymmetry, right? China has way more nuclear weapons, way more ballistic missiles than India does. India's trying to catch up a little bit. It's not going to be able to do it all the way. But the minute India does that, Pakistan's thinking, hey, we don't want to be behind on this. So they're trying to increase their ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons, call it what you will. And then you have, of course, the United States and China competing in the Indo-Pacific, which means that any ballistic missile defense that the United States introduces, introduction of nuclear submarines through Australia into the Indo-Pacific, which is the AUKUS, all of those things might lead China to a more maximalist position, which then will have a trickle-down effect to India and then to Pakistan. And so we can't just see India-Pakistan or India-Pakistan-China in isolation. We've got to see it in a broader sort of sense.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating, the dynamic, the interaction there, and the ways in which each country then feels the need to respond and to escalate, that sort of escalatory practice. Let me before we turn to other things, let me just say to the audience, we'll certainly save time for questions. So if you have questions, put them in there's a Q&A box. Write them in there, and we'll get to as many as them. Excuse me, as many of them as we can. Let me turn to the proliferation side of things. So where we stand now, I think there are 8 nations that have, at least publicly, have nuclear weapons: U.S., Russia, China, UK, France, North Korea, India, and Pakistan. We think Israel probably does. They have a policy of ambiguity about that. And for a long time, a huge focus of the international community has been to limit proliferation. The Non-Proliferation Treaty being probably the best known instrument for that. And indeed, several countries, former Soviet states, including Ukraine, gave them up. I think South Africa as well. So in some sense, we've not seen, other than probably North Korea in recent years, a breakout there. But a lot of conversation about Iran. And so let me just ask you kind of directly, there was an extensive process to negotiate an agreement with Iran involving multiple countries in the Obama administration. President Trump decided that it was not strong enough for whatever reasons, pulled us out of it. And so now there's no agreement on the table. Was that a mistake to withdraw from the Iran agreement?
Yes. This is an unmitigated yes. It was a giant mistake that the Trump administration did. The JCPOA was actually a very good deal. It was meant to cap Iranian nuclear uranium enrichment to 3.67%. Now, for context, what you need for weapons grade uranium is about 90% and above, which means that at 3.67%, they were very far away from getting a bomb. And that would be monitored by the IAEA and the other countries, the European countries that were part of the JCPOA agreement. By withdrawing from that agreement, the United States has done 2 things. One, it's now removed the Iranian need to stick to 3.67. So there are now recent reports that Iran might have actually enriched their uranium to up to 83%. Now, that's not very far from 90%. So by removing that cap on the Iranian nuclear enrichment program, the United States made a giant mistake. The second reason that this was such a big mistake is that how are you going to now credibly negotiate with Iran again? And are you going to be able to stick to the 3.67? What if they say, no, we don't want to stick to 3.67? What if they say, well, we'll stick to 15% or something close to 20%? 20% to 90% is actually about 6 months of time period before you can enrich to that level. So getting to 20 is difficult. 20 to 90 is somewhat faster. So by removing that, a new deal obviously has to be negotiated. And I think one of the reasons that we haven't seen a new deal under the new Biden administration is because the Iranians find the US untrustworthy. And now the US has lost a lot of its leverage in being able to negotiate hard. So all in all, the JCPOA, sort of crumbling under Trump's administration has been a massive hit to the nuclear proliferation world. I mean, if you're North Korea, for example, and you negotiate a deal with the United States, what's to say the next administration isn't going to come and back out of it? So credibility matters. And this goes back to the conversation about reputation that we were having earlier. I think, and in that sense, you might have a stable administration today, but what Trump has really done to the United States, his ability to negotiate in an international forum has, it's going to take a long time to recover from that.
Yeah, so interesting. We were in another context of discussion last evening about U.S.-Japan relations and questions around the architecture that's being put in place in the Indo-Pacific or some of in the security area, and the efforts by the Biden administration to quote Trump-proof these agreements, the extent to which one can be, can credibly commit to future United States in a world where we don't know what the next government would be. Just staying quickly on proliferation, are there other countries that are in the queue, or another way to say this is quite fascinating in a way that we haven't seen more. And so and so a broader question may even be, what are the dynamics that push us towards or push a nation towards proliferation, and what are the ones that seem to be holding them back? So there's kind of a two-part. Are there other nations in the queue, and if there are not a lot of them, why not?
So there are two parts to that answer. First of all, I'll say that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has actually, by and large, been very effective in stopping countries from getting nuclear weapons. And part of that was ensuring that peaceful nuclear use was allowed, civilian nuclear use was allowed. You can build nuclear power plants for nuclear energy. And that was something that a lot of countries wanted at the time. And so it's been fairly effective as a treaty, stopping other countries from getting the bomb. And of course, the United States has also played a large role in this process of, when a country is close to getting a bomb, maybe having negotiations with them, offering them certain things in return, maybe military technology or other scientific technology, etc. Now, that said, we still do have a number of countries which are considering the bomb. South Korea is actually foremost right now. There's a recent report which said that about 70% of the South Korean public, this is done through a survey, about 70% of the South Korean public are in favor of actually getting a nuclear weapon. Now, what can the United States do there? South Korea is an ally. What kind of assurances are required? It looks like, it's as the North Korea issue plays out, increasingly with changes in geopolitical sort of, in the geopolitical situation in Northeast Asia, South Korea wants to be able to deter China, and they're not necessarily sure that the US is going to be credible when it comes to the assurances that they have given South Korea. So that's a major concern. The next concern is, of course, with Iran, which is what we talked about a little earlier. If Iran does get a nuclear weapon, are we going to see Saudi Arabia be far behind? Right? What are we going to see in terms of a response from Israel? So there is a concern that we might have some sort of cascade, a proliferation cascade, if Iran goes nuclear. And then, of course, there's a final question of what is the example that has been set by Ukraine? And a question that keeps getting asked a lot is, if Ukraine did not give up nuclear weapons, would they have been facing what they're facing today? So what are your assurances actually worth? And I'm referring to the Budapest Memorandum here. Why would another country either A, give up nuclear weapons, or B, stop themselves from building nuclear weapons? If the assurances that superpowers or international observers or the UN, if those assurances are worth nothing. So those are all concerns that we have with regard to proliferation today.
Yeah, so it's fascinating to think about the importance of U.S. credibility to the nuclear shield that the U.S. is willing and has provided for a long time. The extent to which our credibility, again, this is the point we were just talking about, really, in some ways, the extent to which our credibility in that space then creates different incentives for other countries. Now, you write about something I never really thought much about, and which is the way in which non-proliferation, by constraining the number of countries that get, have actually in some ways incentivized innovations, let's say, in delivery systems. So it's one thing to have a bomb. It's another thing to get it to someplace on time at a particular location. So maybe I'd love for you to sort of explain that dynamic a bit, and what you see in the research you've done, really all over the world on this issue.
Yeah, so nuclear delivery systems is what I'm writing my book project on. And what's interesting about the nuclear non-proliferation regime, it's been very effective in stopping countries from getting the bomb, but it's not been very effective when it comes to nuclear delivery systems. Part of it is that they were just negotiated out in the 1960s when you had negotiations around nuclear delivery vehicles and the nuclear bomb together. Delivery vehicles were left out. And as a consequence, you've seen countries like India, France, UK sort of talk to each other, exchange technology, space technology that lead to ballistic missiles, aircraft which are capable of dropping nuclear bombs, nuclear submarine technology. So all of this technology has, by and large, been entirely unregulated by the nuclear non-proliferation regime. And so that's a massive gap in the system, if you will. And so that's something that I've been working on in terms of trying to show how that's happened and what are the cases where that's happened as examples, which hopefully will help us plug this gap in the non-proliferation regime.
So let me draw out a little bit more in terms of what so maybe it's impossible to summarize, but what is scary about the innovations in delivery systems? What are these? Is this in some way make even more hair trigger the reaction times that, or make it more difficult to ascertain whether that incoming missile is conventional or nuclear, or what other characteristics of the innovations in delivery systems should we be worrying about?
Right. So there are a couple of things to think about over here. One is, of course, as you mentioned, speed, right? The speed of a lot of ballistic missiles, the use of hypersonic missiles, use of supersonic cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. All of those things make for a more dangerous environment with regard to nuclear weapons and potential for escalation. The second thing is the question of entanglement. Entanglement is when you use nuclear warheads on conventional weapons or weapons that are used for both conventional and nuclear use, what I was talking about earlier with rocket forces and similar missiles, right? So how do you distinguish between one and the other? So that's becoming an increasing problem. And the other issue right now is with modernization, with the use of cyber technology in command and control systems, how secure are these systems, right? How secure are our nuclear weapons from cyber attacks? How secure are they from cyber malfunctions, for that matter, right? What are the risks involved with having very high-tech weapon systems that you might actually lose control of? So those are all things that we need to be thinking about when it comes to nuclear delivery systems.
So you started so thank you for that. And you've begun talking about some of the innovations, some of the new technologies that are on the table. And for a long time, we were worried about MIRVing of rockets, the multiple warheads. And so, and no doubt there, you mentioned in passing the, hypersonic delivery systems. What are now we're talking about, of course, things that, weapons in space. So, what are the things that sort of keep you up at night in terms of, sort of scary new technologies, new innovations in this whole space that you work in?
So, I mean, in the nuclear business, I think there are many things to keep you up at night. I mean, ranging from nuclear weapons that might have malfunctions, all these reports of nuclear accidents that we see, all the times that we've actually had very close calls with nuclear weapons. From, I don't know if nuclear weapons were dropped on North Carolina by the United States, accidentally, of course. And, of the 3 switches that were meant to go off, 2 did, and 1 didn't. And that was a thermonuclear bomb in Goldsboro, North Carolina. So things like that are not uncommon in the nuclear world. And that's a big cause of concern for us. in terms of new technologies, I think really the cyber threat is the big one that is really worrying, in terms of ensuring that your systems are secure, in terms of ensuring that you might actually have even the ability to de-escalate, right? There's recent work being done which looks at crisis communications. What if you can use AI and use deep fakes to mimic, say, President Biden talking to Xi Jinping and issuing a nuclear threat? How do you secure those lines of communication? How do you stop that from happening? Right. So there's different levels. There's the weapons themselves. There's the folks who are in the command and control chain. And then there's the technology, which envelopes both of those parts of the nuclear decision-making calculus, if you will.
Yeah, you mentioned now AI in passing. We're all sort of awakening to this moment of AI. And imagining, you saw a big meeting at the White House, or I guess in Congress, actually. Schumer called it, didn't he? You had, Gates and Musk and Zuckerberg all in one place, all agreeing that this was a problem. And dangerous always to speculate about something as fast moving as AI. But as as a layperson, you sort of think about this, and a fundamental thing you've actually been talking about it is that one has to be able to assess in very short time periods information about a potential threat and make decisions about how to respond to those things. Ever tighter, perhaps, windows, depending on the geography and the technology. AI is really good at making decisions really fast, and assessing lots of data. And yet, what could go wrong? So as you look at this, where do you see that going, and what would be the things that you would really worry about in terms of integrating certain types of AI, obviously, into the nuclear command and control, for example?
So this is one of those things that's really worrying, right? Like, we've got AI right now trying to distinguish on the internet between cat pictures and dog pictures. So from there to putting AI in the nuclear decision-making calculus, I think we've got a long way to go before that actually does happen. But the concern that we have is that, automation is a very, very slippery slope. Do you want any part of that decision-making calculus, be it launch detection, to be it a decision of whether we should be using nuclear weapons or not? Do you want that up to an automated system and remove the human element? I think the answer is no. And, the nuclear world isn't new to the idea of automation. We had the Soviet dead hand, right? The dead hand system was essentially that if the system in the Soviet Union picked up certain seismic action near a lot of the land-based silos of the Soviet Union, and there were a couple of other vectors which it would look at, and made the decision that, yes, our leadership has been taken out by a US nuclear strike. We will launch all our nuclear weapons towards the United States. And it's called the dead hand because if the Soviet Union was in fact obliterated, there would be a dead hand pressing the launch button.
Yeah.
So that automation, that kind of system was there as early as the 1970s. And this is a very Dr. Strangelovian kind of story. But AI kind of is similar in my book, because you're looking at 3 or 4 parameters and you're deciding whether your country has been destroyed or not, and then you decide to launch nuclear weapons. Would the logical thing be to, well, if your country is destroyed, why launch nuclear weapons at all? In defense of whom? Right? So there are all these other broader questions to be asked. So perhaps automation is not the best way to go. One of the reasons that I think human control is so important is the example of Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov from 1983, which is the story is essentially that Petrov was in charge of these high-tech radar systems, and he was monitoring them as they do every day. And one evening in 1983, he noticed that the radar system said that a nuclear attack had been launched against the Soviet Union. And he saw initially one missile, but then the system said that there were 6 missiles that were coming towards the Soviet Union. And he had a decision to make. He had a decision at that point to report this up to the Kremlin so that the Kremlin could launch its nuclear weapons before they were hit. And he decided not to. And the reason he decided not to was that he said, well, the systems are all saying that we've been attacked, but these systems are fairly new and they're prone to malfunction. And he sort of waited, he called his superiors, they discussed it, and then they realized that this was actually the sun's rays bouncing off clouds, which had triggered the radar system. And there was, in fact, no nuclear launch. So that's a story to say, maybe automation isn't the way to go. Let's ensure that there is human control in the decision-making process, especially when it comes to things as dangerous and as consequential as nuclear weapons.
I hadn't heard that story before. That's a little startling, but a good case you make for human control. And I would just remind the audience to put questions in the Q&A. I will get to that, but I want to finish with just a question or two around arms control. We've been talking about the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is still there. But the arms control agreements, I think there's the New START agreement that's still technically it expires in a couple of years, but it's suspended anyway. I mean, basically, we seem to be almost at the end of arms control agreements, and I guess the two-parters, that doesn't on the face of it seem like a good thing. But are we at the end of that era? And I guess the second part of that question is what kind of agreements would we want to have if we could get them? What are the gaps? You mentioned a couple of things early on. Some sort of gaps in the system. What are the things that we really, notwithstanding the current geopolitical climate, that probably makes it quite difficult? What are the things in your mind we really ought to be negotiating and seeing if we could get some kind of consensus at the international level?
So unfortunately, I think you're right, which is that arms control right now seems to be dead. There is absolutely no conversation taking place between the US and the Russians on arms control, on renegotiating New START. We'll see if they actually give it another ad hoc extension. I'm hopeful that they do, but we don't know. There's been talk of, New START and renegotiation of it isn't possible without bringing China to the table. And this was something that the Trump administration really tried to push. And there's no reason that China, with its 450 or so nuclear weapons, is going to come to the table with the US and the Soviet Union. US and Russia. It's a problem of studying Cold War history. The US and Russia, which each have 3,750 nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, there's a big disparity there. So perhaps our expectations are not necessarily realistic when it comes to who we want there to be at the table. I think right now, in terms of arms control agreements, or I'd say more than arms control, what you need right now are confidence building measures. Really. I think one important confidence building measure that the US and the Russians, as well as other countries, could get in on is a multilateral agreement to ensure that nuclear installations, especially nuclear power plants, are not attacked by another country. And I say this in the context of Zaporizhzhia. And this isn't impossible. India and Pakistan actually agreed on the similar framework in 1988. They had this agreement to not attack each other's nuclear installations. And on the 1st of January every year, despite the slump in relations and despite war years, 1st of January every year, both countries exchange a list of nuclear installations that they have. They are off limits. And that's something that should be foremost on our minds, especially in the context of the Ukraine war. In terms of arms reduction, I mean, the hope is, we keep our fingers crossed and we hope that New START continues to exist. We hope that there can be some sort of conversation between all the nuclear states on what is acceptable, right? And the problem is that at one level, we've set the bar very low. You've got an entire movement on the TPNW, right, which is the Treaty to Ban Nuclear Weapons. And you've got at least 130 signatories. The majority of the world is a signatory of the Treaty to Ban Nuclear Weapons, right? And that seems to be right now a very distinct and different conversation. And, one would have hoped that that wouldn't be the case, that we would have a steady progress towards disarmament objectives that the United States itself, as well as other countries, have committed themselves to in the past. But here we are talking about, the death of arms control instead. So that's rather sad.
And maybe even the death of international agreements. It's and their ability to constrain people. Well, I promised that we get to audience questions, and the first one really is in some ways built on what you just said. I mean, Lynn Huber asks, I hate to ask this, but what do you think are the odds that we remain worldwide without use of nuclear weapons for the next century? So that's sort of the big question, right? So,
that I wouldn't want to put a number on that, but I would say that we can hope that the odds are good. We can hope that countries like Russia think about the potential that they too might be attacked with nuclear weapons if they use nuclear weapons. We might think of countries like North Korea looking at their broader interests when it comes to sustaining their own state, which might become untenable if nuclear weapons were used. And we might think that, countries like India and Pakistan would think of their own civilians being affected by the use of nuclear weapons, given the proximity. An important thing to remember is in Asia, you've got a number of countries that are contiguous, which all have nuclear weapons. North Korea, China, India, Pakistan, and then Russia. All of those countries share borders with each other, right? So the impact on civilians, the impact on yourselves are going to be so high, hopefully out of concern for your own and for yourself, we hope that nuclear weapons are not used.
Let's certainly hope so. I mean, there's but coming back to the other point, as long as they're there, there's some non-zero chance of their use, and so on some time scale, you would think they would. Anyway, to come back to that, a contemporary question: how concerned should we be about the talks between North Korea and Russia?
I would say very concerned. Right now, the Russians have been pushed into a situation where they're getting arms, drones from Iran, and they're getting ammunition, rockets, etc. from North Korea. And what's interesting is, the Russians right now are taking massive losses, and they are not being able to keep up with the production of conventional weapons, which the North Koreans are happily helping them with. The question is, how long before Kim Jong-un says, we'll give you this set of weapons and we'll mass produce these weapons. Why don't you give us 50 kilograms of plutonium? These are concerns that the US nuclear community has for sure. And, with Kim Jong-un and Putin meeting in East Russia right now, those are massive concerns. What kind of space technology are they actually talking about exchanging? Well, not exchanging, rather the Russians giving the North Koreans. Is that going to help the North Koreans build better ballistic missiles, which might then in turn be targeting the United States? So those are massive concerns that we might have about the recent meetings.
A couple of questions about agreements. One is, how does Russia's blatant disregard of the Budapest Memorandum affect the future of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime? this goes to the broader question of sort of the rule of law in the international system, but what impact?
So I think there are two parts to that answer. The first is, well, of course, the Russia's blatant sort of disregard of the Budapest memorandum means that more countries are thinking about what might happen to them. Would a Ukraine 2.0 be them, right? Should they get nuclear weapons? It's weakened the non-proliferation order for sure. But there's another aspect to this. And the flip side is that without the Budapest memorandum, do we think that the United States would have given Ukraine as much help as it has? So let me posit this. If we know that limited wars under the nuclear umbrella can take place, we've seen that between India and Pakistan with the Kargil War of 1999. If the Russians attacked, if Ukraine had not given up nuclear weapons and the Russians had attacked Crimea, would you have seen Ukraine use nuclear weapons in Crimea? The answer might be no. And if the answer is no, then those nuclear weapons might not have been terribly useful, right? So in giving up those nuclear weapons and in getting those assurances from the US, Ukraine perhaps did the right thing. If the Ukrainians still had nuclear weapons and Crimea was happening, would the US have given that kind of help that it has? Probably not. So I would say at least the United States has stuck to its side of the bargain when it has come to the Budapest memorandum. It's given as much help to Ukraine as possible. And I don't think that would have happened if the Ukrainians had not given up nuclear weapons. So there is a flip side where other countries might think, well, the United States has stood strong, has been credible in following through on the commitment of an assurance to Ukraine.
Yeah. Let me see if we can get to a couple more of these. Coming back to the issue we talked about early on, there's certain triggers you think that could prompt Putin to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And do you think the use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, could remain at the tactical level, or would escalation be likely?
So what kind of triggers would there be? I think the triggers would have to be massive, right? If Russia faces a massive loss, if some of the Ukrainian counteroffensives are actually good enough to be able to push Russia out of Ukraine, then it's possible that Putin might use the tactical nuclear weapon as a sort of, face-saving mechanism, as a sort of, sure, you've pushed us out, but here's what we have done to you sort of way, which might be slightly immature, but at this stage, we don't necessarily think of Putin as being a rational actor. So everything is on the table. And then this is how nuclear brinksmanship works. On the other hand, do I think that tactical nuclear use will remain tactical? I'm not sure. Because this has been a question throughout, the Cold War years as well. How do you limit escalation? At what point do you say, if you use tactical nuclear weapons, we will use 2 tactical nuclear weapons and stop? If the game is one-upmanship, if the game is to try and inflict more damage onto the adversary, then the only logical conclusion there is that you go up the ladder of escalation up till the point that you actually reach strategic nuclear weapons. I don't know what's stopping us from doing that if the first set of tactical nuclear weapons are used. Which is a long way of saying if tactical nuclear weapons are used, all bets are off. And I wouldn't assume that they would stop at just that level.
Yeah. Just on the Ukraine point, our colleague Rachel Epstein asks, had the Ukrainians kept their nuclear weapons, would they've been able to make a credible threat? Weren't all the command and control mechanisms in Russia? Could they have built their own command and control, or how difficult how high a burden would that have been?
Thanks for the question, Rachel. I think you're right. That would have been a very, very high burden. A number of nuclear experts that I've spoken to over the last year said, look, Ukraine could have kept physical possession of those nuclear weapons. But when it comes to the nuclear codes, when it comes to actually breaking through the permissive action links which allow someone to arm a nuclear missile and then launch them, those things were just not in Ukrainian hands. Now, there were a number of Ukrainians who were part of the Russian strategic forces, and they remained a part of the Russian strategic forces. So in many ways, nuclear weapons were a big burden for Ukraine. If they wanted to make weapons, they could physically try and take apart the warheads and then take the plutonium inside that and then try and fashion their own weapons. Not impossible, extremely difficult and extremely dangerous. And it doesn't seem likely that the Ukrainians were even thinking of doing that. There was at the time, in fact, a big move towards disarmament within Ukraine, and there was a huge amount of public opinion that wanted to give up nuclear weapons. And so those are things that also have to be considered within this giant fold, and this was expensive. It was extremely, and it continues to be extremely expensive to maintain nuclear weapons. You know, the United States is spending $1 trillion to modernize its nuclear weapons. Ukraine at that point of time could not have afforded to maintain and keep those nuclear weapons safely as well. So the supposition that nuclear weapons, that Ukraine might have kept those nuclear weapons and then been able to integrate them into their armed forces, it's really at some level it's a very fantastical sort of idea.
Yeah. We're just about at time. Just a very quick one. Our colleague Martin Rhodes asked a question we haven't talked about. We've been focused on state-controlled weapons, state behavior, but he asked, is there more likely, presumably in state action, that a terrorist organization acquires a dirty bomb, something we've it's been speculated about, and uses it rather than a nation doing it?
Is it likely? Yes, it's been likely for a good amount of time, and not just nuclear weapons, with chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. This entire slew of weapons which you fall under the broader definition of weapons of mass destruction. Now, what might a terrorist organization gain out of that? There's a bigger question there, right? Do we know that Al-Qaeda, for example, tried to acquire nuclear weapons? Yes. They did, but not with much success. So physical safety of nuclear weapons has been high on the agenda of all nuclear states for a while, but this threat has not gone away. And even though we haven't really paid much attention to it today, it's a threat that remains, present, ever present, if you will.
Yeah. So we're just at time. So I asked you early on, or I referenced, what keeps you up at night or makes you sleep. You work on very serious topic, obviously, and at least imagining all kinds of terrible things that could happen and try to figure out how to prevent them. So I'm just curious, if you were not a scholar of nuclear crises, nuclear threats, nuclear proliferation, what else might you have done?
So if I wasn't an academic, I think I would have been a journalist. I wouldn't have been terribly far off from the mark, because I've always been interested in reading, researching. And so I'm, a little known fact is I actually did sign up to a school in New Delhi after my undergraduate degree to pursue a master's in journalism and sort of go there, which is when I found out that I'd gotten through the entrance exams of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in the International Relations Department. So if I didn't actually get that, I would have become a journalist. Hopefully doing investigative journalism. So,
well, in some ways, you're still doing that work. You're certainly, you can understand how you would have been a great journalist. Your ability to take a very complicated issue, the ones we've been talking about today, and really make them clear and understandable. and relatable to all of us. So thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation with you, Debak, and thank you to all of our viewers for being with us today. Best wishes for a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Fritz, and thank you, everyone.